Good evening, everyone. We seem to have an unlucky run on adverse weather conditions on Wednesday evenings. So I really very much appreciate all of you who've braved the elements, the cold, and I hear there's even a little bit of precipitation that's making things unpleasant outside. So thank you all for coming this evening. It's good to see many familiar faces and those of you who are online as well. You are in for a very good and entertaining presentation lecture this evening. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce someone who I think probably most of us know at some level, but nevertheless, I believe it's the first time that you've given a lecture since you've taken up your post here at the U of C, and that is Catherine Kearns. Catherine received her PhD from Cornell University in 2015. After that, she held a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Classics at Stanford University, and then joined the faculty of the Classics Department here at the University of Chicago in 2016. And she has, I want to note, just been promoted to associate professor. This is a very nice and exciting new development that I want to acknowledge, especially since on our promotional materials, it still identifies Catherine as an assistant professor. So kudos and congratulations on that very important distinction. So Catherine is now associate professor in the Department of Classics and the Committee on the Environment, Geography, and Urbanization here at the University of Chicago. Her research examines the intersection between social and environmental change in the Mediterranean landscapes during the Iron Age period. In her first book on the rural landscapes of archaic Cyprus, she analyzes the emergence of Iron Age communities on the island of Cyprus through their land use practices, rural economies, and experiences with changing climate. So that's a theme, obviously, that we'll hear more about, I think, this evening in the context of the archaeology and cultural heritage of Cyprus. But just to give you a little bit more sense of her scholarship, Catherine has recently published a book through King's University Press, The Rural Landscapes of Archaic Cyprus, an Archaeology of Environmental Social Change, as I just mentioned, and then an edited volume with her supervisor at Cornell, many of us know Stuart Manning, on New Directions in Cypriot Archaeology. Let me read a few titles of some of her publications, just their articles, just to give you a sense of the range of her research. So one that came out in 2018, Cyprus and the Surging Sea, Spatial Imaginations of the Eastern Mediterranean. Another one that I like, Mediterranean Archaeology and Environmental Histories in the Spotlight of the Anthropocene. Very important article that she co-published with Stevens, came in 2019 in Science. Archaeological Assessment Reveals Earth's Early Transformations Through Landscape. So part of the theme here is that not only is she studying the archaeological history and environmental history of Cyprus, but also bringing this into a kind of contemporary relevance that, dare I say, is particularly important in this day and age. Just a couple more before I turn the mic over to her. Performing community ritual, copper production, and local politics in archaic Cyprus. Another on a clear day, like this one as a somebody coming from the Eastern, Near Eastern context. On a clear day, the Taurus Mountains hang like a cloud on environmental thought in the archaeology of Cyprus. And one last one, visual representations of gardens, diachronic perspectives on the art of landscape. So it gives you a sense of the range of research and scholarship that Catherine is involved in. And one other last thing is just to note also that she's very active in fieldwork, and in recent years she has, among other, I think, projects, co-directed fieldwork on Cyprus at sites like Kalavasos and also at Maroni, the Built Environment Project. So a lot going on, and look forward to her now talking about this in the context of Cyprus as an archaeological crossroads. Please join me in welcoming Catherine to the
Hello. Well, thank you all for coming out, and I'll follow up. Thank you for that really nice introduction, but also on such a dreary day. Hopefully the landscapes of Cyprus can bring us to a kind of warmer climate. It is my pleasure to be giving an ISAC member lecture. I think within a few years of getting here, I might have gone to one of the curators, Kirsten Newman, and said, I think we should have a member lecture about Cyprus. I think this audience would really like it, you know, Aphrodite's Island. Let me make sure my PowerPoint works here. There we go. It's a large island in the busy eastern corner of the Mediterranean. And as I was thinking about this talk, a title that I almost chose was, why isn't there a gallery exhibit about Cyprus at ISAC? It's very close to the Near East, right? On a clear day, right? The Taurus Mountains of southern Turkey, places like Syria and Lebanon. And surely there's an immediate prosaic answer to that question, which is that there was never a formerly OI or ISAC-led excavation on the island. However, the OI did publish the American Expedition to Idalian in the 1970s. And so there is a bit of a relationship there, but I think a more complicated answer that I'm going to hope to show over the course of this talk lies somewhere in the development of archaeology on Cyprus, whether it is sort of pivoting its inquiry toward the West, the Aegean, the central Mediterranean, or toward the East. And so what I hope to do today is not just like celebrate the archaeology of Cyprus with you all, show you some really cool finds, but also think about the placement and the formation of the archaeology of Cyprus as a distinctive field. And to do that, I like to start with an object. So as I talk, you can try to figure out what this is. This is, it's called the Venus bowl. It's got a flat base, it's sort of shallow, it doesn't appear to be functional. What you can see are 18 crudely modeled human figurines and cows, bulls. And I don't have a pointer, but if you see in the top corner, a little guy peeking over the edge of what appears to be a doorway or a threshold. This is made in a red polish style, which is a kind of conventional ceramic style of what we call the early Bronze Age and middle Bronze Age on Cyprus, which is roughly the end of the 3rd millennium, beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE. This particular object was found at a site called Belapais Venus on the northern coast, and it's become one of the most important cemeteries of this period. And it's a period that's really important. Many of you might be familiar with earlier Middle Bronze Age in other regions for the sort of transition to more solid forms of social inequality, the sort of rise of state complexity in the Middle Cypriot or Middle Bronze Age period. And so probably what we have at Venus, and this is a cemetery site, is an egalitarian sort of farming pastoral community that's starting to experiment with forms of hierarchy, social complexity. So I'm showing you also, it was found in a tomb 22. It's a pretty typical tomb at the site. It was looted in antiquity, but based on the other finds there, it appears to maybe be an important person potentially interred inside. All right, let's look more at this object. There have been a number of interpretations on what this is. It's clearly not a functional bowl or drinking vessel. There are a couple clues that suggest that this is a deliberate scene intended for display. So there's the doorway, and you kind of look in, and in the upper left, there appears to be what might be a throne with some anatomically male figure seating on it, facing the back wall, which based on comparanda might be a shrine. Then you have various kind of configurations of people in a ring watching or participating. And then of course, this guy at the bottom who's just sort of peeking over the edge, maybe not allowed to participate. Porphyrios Thikeos, who was the person to excavate this site, considered it potentially cult activity related to some sort of early Middle Bronze Age bull or fertility cult, maybe the chthonic deity represented by snakes. Others have seen it as a funerary cult. Others have seen it as an ideological expression of hierarchy. There's something happening here. There's some kind of inaccessible right where some people are excluded and others are allowed to participate. So I start with this object partly because it's really cool. And I've thought sometimes that if I hadn't focused on the Iron Age, I would have focused on the early Cypriot period just because of objects like this. But I also use it as a jumping off point to think about the conjunctures of archaeological work that happen on an island like Cyprus. So Belopais Vounous, where this object came from, attracted initial archaeological attention in the beginning of the 20th century by a range of international scholars. So Einar Gerstad, leader of the Swedish Cyprus expedition in the late 1920s, Claude Schaeffer of the French expedition in the 1930s, Dikeos, representing the Cyprus Museum, who excavated about 40 to 50 tombs in the 1930s, followed then by the British School of Athens, led by the Australian James R. Stewart, in the 40s, in the later 30s and into the 40s. So a site like Belopais is really interesting for thinking about the intersection of a number of different emerging sort of archaeological practices and traditions that are coming both off the island and on the island. And I use in my title this framework of a crossroads, because I think what I'd like to do for the rest of this talk is think about how Cypriot archaeology has been conceptualized, particularly as it relates to capturing those sort of intersecting innovations in archaeology as it developed over the late 19th and 20th and into the 21st centuries, as well as the sort of confluence of contexts of colonialism, imperialism, national independence, and so on. Now, this metaphor of a crossroads, you might have seen it with Cyprus. I'm showing you just a number of recent titles of either museum collections or scholarly works that call it a crossroads of culture, or a sort of like a meeting place. And many of these are trying to capture that it's an island in the busy Mediterranean. Many different cultures encountered each other there. And certainly there's a way that the crossroads metaphor is meant to think about sort of like melting pots, hybridization over different periods. Sometimes I find this metaphor to be a little uncomfortable because of the way that it seems to treat the island as sort of a passive playground where other cultures mix it up. It sometimes can create the idea that transformations happen due to external cultural influences rather than indigenous development, or to restrict our gaze to the sort of vulnerability of Cyprus to outsiders. It has also more negatively led to the idea that this is partly on the basis of travelers and others, the emergence of archaeology on the island, to judge it by how it measures up to other mainland cultures, particularly the Aegean or the Near East. So here I'm just giving you a smattering of examples over the 20th century that are comparing the material culture to various other traditions, whether it be Greece. And this idea comes out that it's marginal, it's peripheral, it's a kind of like backwater to what everything else is happening in the Mediterranean or in the Near East. And so these tend to create this idea of not measuring up to other contemporary cultures. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is try to rethink of crossroads more as an intellectual problem. The archaeology of Cyprus is a very distinctive field. It's been shaped by a number of different research traditions, most chiefly prehistory, classics, Near Eastern studies, and it's conveyed through very influential, prominent individual scholars, as well as broader structural changes in the field. So what I'd like to do for the rest of the talk is highlight, through a number of objects like the Vounous bowl, the shaping of Cypriot archaeological studies and the toggling of how archaeologists, particularly foreign archaeologists, as well as the emergent discipline of Cypriot studies on the island, have sort of toggled it between other regional traditions and have thought about its past. And I think the cultural interactions did happen on the island, but we can't necessarily always think of them through the lens of the culture contact model. The other thing, and I'm being selfish here, is that I really just want to highlight Cypriot archaeology. So I'm going to try to show some really juicy, distinctive finds over the course of 150 years of excavation. We're going to move from the 19th century, the Antiquarian period, through British annexation and colonization of the island, the creation of things like the Cyprus Museum and the Department of Antiquities in the early 20th century, various forms of archaeological knowledge building through things like classification, and into the latter 20th century, where we turn to creations like the University of Cyprus, as well as World Heritage status. So where does cultural heritage sit now? Okay, And each one of these objects is kind of going to pivot back and forth in time. So hopefully that's clear as we go through this progression. Let's start with another object. This one's very big. So what you're looking at is a very large stone vase found at the site of Amathus on the south central coast, dating to the Archaic period. So now we're in the Iron Age, the 7th and 6th centuries. It's a colossal vessel. It's mostly plain. You can see some decoration in the form of these basically non-functional handles that were created on it. And it was found, probably it was one of 2 or 3 of these massive stone vessels made out of local limestone that sat on the Acropolis, or the high promontory of this Iron Age city. And what we know is that during this time, it was a sanctuary at the top of the Acropolis. Interestingly, in the 1970s, re-examination of the vessel found a really cool but enigmatic inscription on one of the handles in the local language. So we know that a site like Amathus in the Iron Age was multi-ethnic and multilingual. You had Phoenician and Semitic languages, Greek, and a local indigenous language that remains undeciphered because most of the evidence is very fragmentary, as well as a local syllabic script that is unique and distinctive to Cyprus. And one of the things that makes it really cool is that it actually crosses the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Now, the inscription is sort of hard to make out. It probably relates to the cult of a great goddess at the sanctuary, what later became Aphrodite in the classical and Hellenistic periods. But the site really started to attract a lot of attention because it was mentioned in Greek and Roman sources like Ovid or Strabo. This colossal vessel was recognized by early modern travelers to Cyprus as unique. And this was a period of antiquarianism where you had foreign-led expeditions by amateurs, by gentlemen, scholars, by statesmen like diplomats or servicemen who were in the pursuit of collecting antiquities, often to bring back to emerging or fledgling national museums. And the stone vase, the French recorded and engraved it and made representations of it in 1865, and already by 1866, it was in the Louvre. And you can see a quote here where the sort of like, one, how do we get this absolutely massive 13-ton in weight stone vessel into the Louvre, but also where should we put it? Would you put it between the Egyptian gallery and the Assyrian gallery? What is the sort of like beginnings of a kind of reckoning of where Cypriot material culture should be situated in these early museums? Now, because of this antiquarian interest in the mid to late 19th century, which fascinated particularly Western travelers coming from places in the European continent, who saw Cyprus through the lens of Greek and Roman sources, sites like Amathus and vessels like this, which were immediately shipped to Paris, became ransacked for antiquities. And here's another quote: "Even the hill of Amathus is fast losing its form, while the rock of which it is composed is being cut away to be shipped elsewhere." So this is a period of colonial theft, we could call it, really sort of rapacious attempts to collect antiquities and bring them into other collections, whether private or, again, for things like the Louvre. The quote I just read for you was made by this person. And we can't really discuss 19th century archaeology on Cyprus without mentioning Luigi Palma di Cesnola, who was American consul to Cyprus between 1865, roughly 1875. And if you're familiar with a name like Heinrich Schliemann, that's roughly in the ballpark that we're talking about. So already at the time that Cesnola was using his diplomatic position to acquire antiquities from Cyprus, he was being accused of doing it improperly and sloppily and unethically. This was a sort of equated to tomb robbing or treasure hunting. He took over 35,000 objects from sites across the island in this span, and he actually did it illicitly. So by the time he wanted to ship them off island, the Ottomans, who were in control of Cyprus at the time, caught wind of it, expected him to request a permit, and he tried to basically flee during the night, loaded it all onto a ship. Where did it go? 20,000 of those objects created the windfall for the beginnings of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. where he then served as the first director. And you can see that again, so New Yorkers in the mid to late 19th century are aware of the Mediterranean past. They're familiar with things like Greek and Roman sources. Here comes this absolute treasure of Mediterranean objects. They're very eager and enthusiastic about it. But the Cypriot objects are not really matching up to the Greek and Roman sculptures or material culture that they're used to seeing. So you can see quotes like this from the New York Times. I mean, what are these? It's certainly an early period of art, but then it's bad art. It's shockingly bad art. Also, I mean, Cesnola was a real scoundrel, and already at this time he is brought to court for like the improper restoration of many of these objects. And so in addition to bringing tens of thousands of objects to places like New York, it's the sort of like emergence of a discussion about archaeological ethics. By the end of the 19th century, and this is like a kind of takeaway point here, Cypriot artifacts are incredibly important to the rising consciousness of Mediterranean antiquity, but they're sort of being pushed to one side. As we shift a bit later to the beginnings of British administration of the island as a colony in 1878, we can see the turn to establishing typologies and classificatory schemes. And a lot of this is reckoning with what Cesnola did, right? Going in, digging holes, taking everything that he can out, not recording anything, not being aware of things like context. And actually in 1882, local Cypriots could see what was happening and petitioned the British government to create the Cyprus Museum. So the National Museum of Cyprus was actually created in response to Cesnola. So this is a period of the beginnings of systematic understandings of material culture, as well as more broadly in the field, particularly of Mediterranean archaeology, of an awareness of time before Homer. So like the real creation of an understanding of prehistory. British expeditions to Cyprus started in the 1880s. What you're looking at in this example is a bowl, a drinking bowl, and the ware is called base ring. It's a sort of thin, highly fired ceramic style. That's one of three very typical common styles of what we call the late Cypriot period of the late Bronze Age. So roughly the 14th and 13th centuries. Many have described it as almost trying to imitate metal. So the way that it looks and the thinness and even the acoustics of it are meant to resemble something like bronze. These two objects, and you can see other sort of emerging styles of the late Bronze Age, particularly what people call this wishbone handle. These were excavated in a tomb at a site called Larnaca Lachăturiu, which is on the southeastern coast, and it was probably a middle to late Bronze Age settlement on the edge of a rising urban settlement, a city. And the late Bronze Age is really where urbanism starts to take off on Cyprus, called Hala Sultan Teke. So that's where the second example is from. This tomb was excavated by John Linton Myers. He came from Oxford. He was trained as a classical archaeologist. He then was professor of ancient history at Oxford from 1910 to 1939. He actually had wanted to study in Greece, but his supervisor said, well, you know, I think they could use some help on Cyprus. Why don't you get some excavation experience on Cyprus? So in 1894, he was sent to supervise the now British expedition to Amathus. Within 5 years of working on Cyprus, he undertakes the beginnings of a first real systematic study of Cypriot material culture. And that is a catalog of the materials of the newly established Cyprus Museum. And this is a period, again, of archaeological culture history, where we're trying to, and scholars are trying to come up with classificatory schemes, periodization, material culture traits and attributes to connect to past cultures. So you can see a lot of description and identification here of objects, trying to situate them in relation to one another. He is the person who coins the term base ring. So it's people like John Myers, Max Onefalsch-Richter in the late 19th century who start this really important work of creating a systematic foundation for the study of all Cypriot material culture. And he gives us a whole classificatory scheme of Bronze Age, particularly Iron Age and later materials. And you can see the classical archaeology influence here because for many of the things, he's trying to relate them to other traditions. So Iron Age pottery might be called Cypriot Phoenician. or it's got an Egyptian influence, right? It's trying to connect the material culture to these also emergent and existing classificatory schemes. So John London Myers is really important for a shift into systematic study in Cypriot archaeology. He also writes the handbook of the Chesnola collection at the Metropolitan Museum. So he's the first one to really try to systematize that material. And with this sort of categorization, the early 20th century sees rapid advances in the study of distinctive cultures and periods across the island. And with more archaeological work, chance finds and discoveries can now actually be sort of studied in aggregate with these emerging sort of understandings of periodization, of chronology, and of regional differences. So, for example, around 1930, a farmer from the Morphu Bay, northwestern region of the island, brings a terracotta head that he found in a plot to Nicosia, where the government is, the capital city. And this leads officials to start a rescue excavation at a site called Aya Irini, where they find this. It's the largest cache of terracotta votives, I think, anywhere in the Mediterranean. It's something like 2,000 votives made out of clay that were found in situ in a semicircular arrangement around a limestone altar. They range in size. You can see there are very small ones. The average is about 20 centimeters high up to life size. They were probably deposited in a single event in the 8th and 7th centuries, the Archaic period at this sanctuary. There's evidence going back to the late Bronze Age, but it's really in the 9th and 8th centuries that we see an open air sanctuary created here. In Cypriot archaeology, it's actually really hard to identify the deity based on votives, but just in terms of like a broad pattern, out of, I think, these 2,000 votives, there are only 2 that are anatomically female. The rest are male, and they show some evidence potentially of bull cult, right? Of some potential male fertility deity, something like that. So the site was excavated by international archaeologists resident in Cyprus at the time, who are credited with the beginnings of scientific excavation on the island and really paying attention to things like stratigraphy, site formation processes in the late 1920s and 1930s. So this is the Swedish Cyprus expedition, which was created by Einar Gerstad in 1927. He has, like John London Myers, a kind of chance encounter where he was on his way to Greece to excavate a Greek site, and his supervisor sends him to Cyprus. Within a few years, he proposes a really ambitious project with a number of other archaeologists to start a kind of monumental, extensive archaeological research finding mission across the island. They wanted it to be highly flexible and moving. So basically really start to establish a chronology for all material culture on the island. And within 4 years, 1927 to 1931, they excavated 25 sites, so settlements, palaces, theaters, sanctuaries, 375 graves all over the island, ranging in time from the Neolithic up to the Roman period. 18,000 properly excavated objects were recorded. Now, using things like Myers' classificatory scheme, they could actually be slotted into periodization. And more importantly, they were actually paying attention and recording things like stratigraphy. And the original concept of the expedition was to undertake and to establish a chronology. Now, in the bottom right-hand corner, this is another sort of like check to say that we're still in a colonial context. Antiquities laws at the time were not strong enough to safeguard or steward all objects on the island, despite the existence of something like the Cyprus Museum. So the Swedish Cyprus expedition was able to leave with 2/3 of everything they found. So 10,000 objects make their way back to Stockholm, most of that Aya Irini assemblage, for example. This is yet another way that we see Cypriot antiquities kind of transforming global museum collections and archaeological scholarship off island. It was not until 1935, with the establishment of the Department of Antiquities, that a new law was created to strengthen stewardship of all excavated finds. And it's within this context of the sort of expanding innovations in field techniques that I wanted to touch on another site, and it's partly just that I don't think we can talk about Cyprus without mentioning copper. So many of us might be familiar with the importance of copper and its relationship with Cypriot prehistory and history. So in the map, what you're looking at in purple and pink are what are called the pillow lavas that encircle the central Troodos Massif. And these are the the copper bearing ores, the rock formations from which people started exploiting copper, beginning all the way in earliest prehistory, but it really starts to ramp off during the late Bronze Age. What you're seeing in the black and white image are called tuyers, which are sort of infrastructural elements of kilns and furnaces, which were used to smelt the ore and turn it into liquid or molten copper, which was then shaped into various kinds of transportation shapes, like the ingot. So the tuyers were found at this site called Apliki Karamalos. They date to the 13th century. And this is another example of like the 1930s with the creation of the Cyprus Museum and the establishment of salvage archaeology. This site was actually identified first by the Cyprus Mining Corporation. So where it is located in Apliki in the Solea Valley, which is actually the richest ore deposits on the island, which were being exploited in the 1930s. And the Mining Corporation found archaeological artifacts. So again, they went to Cyprus, to the museum, to Nicosia, and requested sort of like expert judgment. And this woman, Joan de Plot Taylor, was sent to lead a kind of like 2-year rescue excavation of the site called Apliki Karamalos. And what she established was this really important mining settlement. So this is directly related to where the ores are, to the mines and the galleries. It's a metallurgical workshop where they're converting ore into copper, creating those transportation objects, and then bringing it back to things like late Bronze Age cities. De Plot Taylor was actually trained by Mortimer Wheeler, so very aware of emerging scientific techniques in excavation. She had also volunteered to work at the Cyprus Museum with people like John Linton Myers and Einar Gerstad. And so she was introduced to archaeology through the work of the Swedish Cyprus expedition. And what's really important about her site is establishing the importance of something like copper production during the late Bronze Age, and not just a settlement or a tomb, but an actual site of metallurgical activity. Now, we know that Cyprus was connected to copper. It was one of the richest, it's one of the richest countries in copper per surface area in the world. We see these, they're called oxide ingots, all across the Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age, and actual compositional analyses have shown that I think over 50% of them relate to Apliki in their sort of like lead isotopic composition. They show up all over the Mediterranean, places like Sardinia, even up into like Eastern and Central Europe, and of course the Near East. We also have symbolic representations of the ingot. So we know that particularly in the late Bronze Age, through things like textual documents as well, that Cyprus is very closely connected to something like the trade in commodities of copper amongst states like Ugarit, the Hittites, Egypt. We also find it in really important shipwreck cargoes like the Uluburun. I like focusing though on Taylor's work because she was really prescient in the sort of shift to understanding that excavation can record everything, not just the objects that go into museums. So what she did in 1938, 1939 was actually record things like seeds and preserve them, wood fragments, animal bones, elements of baskets. So the site was actually pretty well preserved. Things like loom weights, scrapers, planewares, courswares, in a kind of attempt to really understand holistically the site. Everything from everyday consumption and production to what they're eating, to what they're growing, what they might be trading for. And it's that kind of forward thinking in the late 1930s that has allowed archaeologists recently to go back to those collections and start to radiocarbon date them, to refine our chronologies of the late Bronze Age. And it's also just an incredibly important type site for thinking about the political economy of the period. So not just palaces and settlements, or cemeteries, but production. My next site is very similar to that. This is what you're looking at is called the Horned God. It's a statuette made out of bronze. It's roughly 55 centimeters in height. He's wearing this really funky like helmet with horns, which specialists consider a sort of evidence of Cypriot kind of like eclecticism. It combines Near Eastern and Aegean sort of like iconographic elements, but it is very much an indigenous cult deity. Again, we sort of have to use other circumstantial evidence to think about what types of cult or what elements of the deity might have been forwarded here. But it comes from a site called Enkemi, really important late Bronze Age city, urban city. You can see in a section of the grid plan like this, orthogonal streets, monumental architecture. And it came from what's called an ashlar building, so really impressive, large monumental structure. And it was found in a room, which clearly appears to have been marked out as important. So it had really elaborate, it was elaborately built. It had direct access to other rooms around it. It was probably facing the main entrance of this important building. And people have called it a sanctuary. And there are other elements of trying to think about the horned god, particularly the recovery in this room and others nearby of ox skulls, antlers, small bronze statuettes of bulls, models of horns and gold leaf, as well as what you're seeing in these images, incredibly impressive deposits of bowls stacked on top of each other. This is a really rare find in archaeology to see this kind of deposition. The bowls, if you go back a few slides, are reminiscent of that base ring drinking bowl that I showed you of the same period, except this time they're made out of a different ware and they're wheel made. So it's a shift in ceramic technology, but they're repeating the same form. Yorgos Papasavvas, an expert on late Cypriot studies, has therefore argued that what we're probably seeing is a feasting context that might even have acted as a sort of closure ceremony for this sanctuary, because it was then abandoned, sort of right after this feasting deposit. So you can imagine people drinking, putting their cups maybe in a pile and leaving, and as well as you see in that upper right image, leaving the horned god there. Other parts of the site have later occupation histories, but it's a really interesting capture of ritual activity during the late Bronze Age. And Enkemi remains the most extensively excavated site for the period, and it's significant. People debate whether it's like the most important site for the late Bronze Age for studying urbanism, but it's clearly really important for how we think about late Cypriot trade, particularly off island. The story of the excavation of Enkemi is another one as an entryway of thinking about sort of competing traditions in the formation of Cypriot archaeology. So growing interest in proto-history, and particularly the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaeans, Ugarit, the Hittites, the Egyptians, right, trying to explain those sort of interconnections, by the 1930s was leading many people to Cyprus. So Claude Schaeffer, who had been the excavator of Ugarit, Ras Shamra, already by the 1930s saw Enkemi as really intriguing. And unlike others who had sort of called it a cemetery of the late Cypriot period, he argued that it was probably an urban settlement, and it was probably very much like Ugarit. He was coming from a Near Eastern perspective. So in 1948, he goes to the then director of the Department of Antiquities, AHS Peter McGraw, and asks for a co-led joint expedition to excavate Enkemi. You know, the French can't do it on our own. We need to join forces with the Cypriot Museum and expose as much of this city as we can. But as Yorgos Papasavvas' recent book, Trench Warfare at Enkemi, recollects through archival correspondence and like the gray literature of people like Schaeffer, it was almost a doomed expedition from the start because of competing interpretations of the site from the sort of French perspective, the Near Eastern perspective, the Cypriot nationalist perspective, orientations to thinking about Mycenae and the Aegeans, and it only lasted 4 years. And Papasavvas does a really important job of showing that this is also a moment in the 1940s and 50s where you really have the field of archaeological practice moving on. And so Dikeos represents the sort of rigorous scientific method, learning from people like Einar Gerstad, that sort of systematic, rigorous, record everything method, whereas Schaeffer was part of like an older tradition of these massive manned open trenches, recording very little as lots of frenzied work is happening. And it was partly fights and tension over how to excavate and how to interpret phasing that led to the collapse of this project. Dikeos kept working there, immediately published his findings, which have proven to be incredibly important for the study of the late Bronze Age period. It's actually very difficult to study the French expedition side because of the poor recording system. But you can also see, again, the sort of the formation of something like late Bronze Age studies wrestling with the intersections of different traditions of archaeology and different expectations of what a site like Enkemi is supposed to mean. And here's just one example from the archival material. So this is the Cypriot workmen writing, in this case to Schaeffer, we expect you to return again in order to bring in light all the ancient Greek, where they had originally written Cyprus towns, right? So there's an orientation to seeing now Enkemi as a more Mycenaean urban settlement of the late Cypriot period. And this leads to decades then of debate and discussion over something like Mycenaean colonization to the island, which was incredibly important on the eve of its national independence. It's a Greek-speaking predominantly island. So something like dating and proving and identifying the arrival of Greek-speaking migrants to the island took on lots of importance. And so that particular site is a really cool window into thinking about also just like the creation of late Bronze Age studies on Cyprus. My next example brings us back to Aphrodite, partly because I felt like I had to show something of her. This is a marble sculpture found at the site of Salamis, so very close to Enkemi, actually. It was an early Iron Age settlement that shifted just a little bit south after the abandonment of Enkemi. And what you're looking at is the Roman era city of Salamis, also known as Constantia in the Roman period. And this is a local limestone, or actually no, probably from Anatolia, the limestone. And Salamis had a really long, rich history as an Iron Age city, but by the Hellenistic period, its prominence has really grown because it was acting as a sort of government administrative seat for the Ptolemaic Hellenistic kingdom, which was controlling Cyprus at the time. By 58 BCE, the Romans annex it. And of course, by the 1st century CE, it becomes a Roman imperial province, actually with Cilicia. So Cyprus is sort of administratively tied to southern Turkey. And despite the fact that the administrative seat moves to Paphos, Salamis remains really important and a sort of favored city on the part of Roman emperors, particularly Trajan and Hadrian, who become benefactors of the site. They rehabilitate existing civic infrastructure, things like the gymnasium, the theater. They add things like amphitheater, stadium, Roman baths, as well as these types of sculptures. And on an iconographic level, sculptures like this are very much tied to Roman Eastern sculptural traditions. So the way that the Roman Empire starts to incorporate Eastern styles of iconographic production. I mentioned this site partly because it's a very important site in Cypriot archaeology, but partly also because it was excavated by Vassos Karagiorgis, who is also one of the most influential Cypriot archaeologists on the island. He had studied at the University of London. He began as an assistant curator at the Cyprus Museum in 1952. By 1960, he's the curator of the museum. And by 1963, he's the director of the Department of Antiquities. And this is a period of an incredible sort of explosion of foreign-led projects on the island, partly due to this man. His sort of relentless promotion of Cypriot cultural heritage and archaeology, attracting foreign teams to the island, protecting heritage. This is a moment in the mid-20th century where we have a lot of rise in tourist industries, the threat of kind of modernization of archaeological sites, and he's doing a lot to create the kind of salvage or protection infrastructure for archaeological sites. And so it's his promotion of Cypriot archaeology that really adds a new phase of an awareness of Cypriot material culture, particularly also in global museums, because he sets about either rewriting or producing handbooks for many of the collections in global or private collections. But this site is also important, if you'll notice in the date of when he was excavating, because it's for another reason, and that is that 1974, after an Athens-led coup on the island, leads to Turkish intervention and invasion in 1974 and the complete division and disruption of the island. So not only does work at places in the north stop, places like Salamis, but Karagiorgis actually goes into sort of emergency mode to protect the Cypriot Museum during the summer of 1974 under threats of something like the targeting of the city in Nicosia. What happens in 1974 is massive population dislocation, population transfer. So Turkish Cypriots head into the northern third of the island, Greek Cypriots head into the southern part of the island, and it halts all archaeological work on the north side. So from 1974 on, any attempt to sort of think about the whole island is hampered. In the words of one Cypriot archaeologist, it's like the field has been working on one leg since 1974. Any attempt to understand archaeological sites in the north has to rely on legacy collections. There can be no more expansion or discovery in the north. All projects and excavations have to happen in the south. And so in addition to the trauma, right, and the dislocation and the disruption of what's happening on the island politically and socially, this really changes Cypriot archaeology, and particularly ideas of heritage, and attempts to sort of connect something like archaeological material culture to a national consciousness, which is now separate or sort of like ethnically separate from what it had been in previous decades. So it has a lot of implications for something like the way that archaeological culture is used in national identification. Karagiorgis is also really important for maintaining a sort of handle on archaeology. And after 1974, he is the one who is actually finding and proposing additional sites in the south for foreign-led teams to try to maintain an awareness and a stewardship of material culture. Okay, I know I'm coming to an end. I just have a couple more examples. I wanted to show one example of not just site-based research, but landscape-based research. So what you're looking at in this example is pretty singular on Cyprus. We don't have the tell formations of the Near East, very few mounded settlements on Cyprus. This is a tumulus, or at least an earthen mound, at the site of Paphos, which was a really important Iron Age city. It's known now by its village name of Kuklia, but very interregionally important as the site of the most sacred or most important sanctuary of Aphrodite. This is the one that's actually mentioned in Homer and Hesiod, the Paphian deity. And you can see in the image that recent work is trying to understand the broader political landscape. So in addition to the sanctuary, excavations have revealed royal residence at Kuklia Haji Abdullah, as well as production facilities, so the making of things like purple dye from murex shells to create textiles. And what has been discovered over the last 15 years is an absolutely massive rampart wall, defensive structure, built during the 5th century, so the classical period, that extends and connects the royal residence to this tumulus. You can see examples of the really well-preserved mud brick and stone construction. Very enigmatically, when this team excavated the tumulus, what they found is potentially a decoy chamber. So it appears that it might not even have been intentionally meant for a royal burial. It was looted in antiquity, but it was actually created and then the mound was put on top of it with nothing else in it. So there's a really interesting sort of like question about landscape formation here. And I actually, that's me in that top right corner. I had the very fortunate privilege to work on this site when it was first excavated. So this is us revealing for the first time some of these mud bricks. I mentioned the site mostly to privilege a person like Maria Kovu, who's leading the excavations. She comes out of the lineage of studying from people like Karagiorgis. She's also part of the creation of the Archaeological Research Unit at the University of Cyprus, which is the sort of academic heart of Cypriot archaeology. And she's very much advocating a Cyprocentric approach to archaeology. So working now over the last couple decades, taking Cypriot archaeology on its own terms, really embracing from like a bottom-up macro historical perspective what makes Cypriot archaeology distinctive, and then thinking about interregional connections. My last example, just to bring us into more recent issues of cultural heritage, are what are called the painted churches of the Troodos. This is a grouping of 9 or 10 Byzantine churches ranging from the 11th to the 16th centuries, everything from small sort of rural architecture churches to monasteries, and they are known for this absolutely incredible, elaborate and intricate and highly refined painting, frescoes, and icons inside. They're one of the richest concentrations of Byzantine art in the Mediterranean, and so they show this really interesting artistic influence over a period of about 500 years. They connect both indigenous artistic traditions with Byzantine sort of like metropolitan artistic styles. They are also living monuments. They continue to be used as places of worship and for other religious practices, and so they preserve that original function. They also include a really incredible amount of inscriptions, which is uncommon in Byzantine and late medieval art. And so they're really important for things like dating Byzantine artistic styles. Why do I mention them here? These churches were the first to receive World Heritage status by UNESCO in 1985. So this is obviously the kind of like attempt, roughly 10 years after the military incursion and the occupation of the North, to establish, like convert national heritage into the kind of like symbolic capital at the global level. So first in 1985 and then expanded in 2008 to include these 10 churches. And this has raised a lot of really important questions about heritage, about national designations of heritage, particularly because these are in the south, in the Republic of Cyprus, and what that means for heritage in the north, where we still have many Byzantine churches that have been intensively looted or destroyed. And so it's the consideration of heritage and the politics of heritage, and especially movable heritage, so things like Byzantine icons, that have actually catalyzed Cypriot sort of like world or global recognition of its material culture. So already in 1989, and a lot of this is spearheaded and catalyzed by the Church of Cyprus, because these are living sort of religious institutions and material worlds. In 1989, a very well publicized court case exposed illicitly looted and removed Byzantine frescoes, so 6th century frescoes from North Cyprus post 1974, which ended up in the collection of an art dealer in Indiana. And actually the court case vindicated the Church of Cyprus. They were repatriated. And so this catalyzed recognitions of something like cultural repatriation, as well as Cyprus's sort of like stake. In 1999, the US for the first time adopts emergency restrictions on the import of Byzantine cultural material. And that initial action has evolved into a longstanding memorandum of understanding, which is repeated every 5 years. But it's these Byzantine artifacts, actually, partly promoted through the Church of Cyprus and protected and stewarded, that are catalyzing a lot of like US attention to something, or UNESCO global attention to something like the heritage of Cyprus. The sort of soft power cultural diplomacy at work here. Okay, I'm winding up. Where does Cypriot archaeology belong? It's very influenced in phases by orientations to west and east. And it's the confluence, the crossroads, I'm going to say, that archaeological crossroads of international archaeologists and Cypriot archaeologists that have shaped the field, but under real colonial conditions. I think that's a really important part of the story of the development of Cypriot archaeology. The preponderance, right, of British, American, French, Swedish, Australian, Irish names in the history that I've just shown you testifies to the interest of the outside world in Cyprus, but as well as how colonialism tends to favor certain kinds of research, and as well as the movement of Cypriot antiquities off island. And yet Cyprus is distinctive compared to certain other Eastern Mediterranean regions. There are no foreign schools like the American school in Athens or the British school until the establishment of CARI, the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, in 1978. And that's not really a school, it's more like an institute for international research. So I think there's a paradox here in that it's a place for generations of scholars. It's a place where many have called it marginal and peripheral, and yet Cypriot antiquities have catalyzed global museum collections since the late 19th century. And that's a really important part of the story. And so to come back to my kind of like, why isn't there a gallery of Cyprus at ISAC? I think it's complicated, right? For much of the history of the development of archaeology, it has oriented itself toward the West, toward the Aegean. It's been embedded in these kind of common notions of Europe, of Greekness, what it means to be Western, right? Particularly in modernity. Yet paradoxically, the archaeology of Cyprus is actually most visible in Near Eastern studies. So something like Asor is where archaeologists from around the world talk about Cyprus. And Asor is actually what created the initiative for CARI in the 1970s. It was the Institute for the Studies of, at that time, Oriental Research that was really catalyzing international, institutional presence on Cyprus. So while it has focused a lot on the West, it's also embedded in a lot of scholarly networks that face East. And so it's this kind of really important paradox. And I show you these examples because I think a final takeaway here is that the next time you're in a museum and you see something that says it's from Cyprus, to pause and say, how did it get there? And what's the framing of Cyprus being told in that particular gallery? Sort of like captions or exhibits or labels. How is it being framed? And I think rather than seeing the development of the field as it's sort of like, well, it's not Greek enough, it's not classical enough, or it's not Near Eastern enough, we can appreciate that it's what makes Cypriot archaeology so distinctive, is it's sort of like paradoxical and singular nature. So thank you very much. I'll end there and I'm happy to take questions.